Okay. Well, good morning. I'm popping on a bit earlier today because it's Mother's Day in South Africa. And so I have to go to brunches and lunches, and you know that. On the topic, I think having a mom that loves you is the most important thing you can ask for in a mother. And I'm so thankful that I've had that all my life. And so, Mom, if you at some point venture out to watch this video, you know that I love you and thank you for loving me. Right, so today I'm in the second part of, I guess you can't even call the series. I'm basically working through some articles that I've written recently, trying to pen down my thoughts after a very long process of about 4 to 5 years of studying. And so that's what this is about. This is the second part. The first one was the previous part, which was I've changed my mind about the Bible. And in that session, I was a little bit more personal about my life and my journey and what I've been through in the last 4 or 5 years or so. Actually, it's a bit longer than that. But yeah, so today is basically going to be about the fact that the Bible is not a book. So this is the first of 3 pillars that I grew up with. The Bible is a book, the Bible is univocal, and the Bible is inerrant. And those were the 3 pillars of, I guess, sola scriptura, which is in itself one of the pillars of the Protestant Reformation, of which I was a product, I guess, and I still am. But today I want to focus on a very simple idea that the Bible is in fact not a book. And I think a lot of people might disagree with this, but I think a lot of people might actually say, yeah, of course, it's not just one book, it's many books. Fine. But the way that we deal with the Bible, we as Christians, as we make the assumption that it's a book. So what is a book? I mean, a book is basically a piece of text, literature, written by one author with many stories maybe, but with one central message. And I grew up believing that this is in fact what the Bible is. The Bible is simply a book authored by God, and in each story it has the same message: Jesus loves you, right? And although I don't disagree with the idea that Jesus or God loves us, I have started realizing that the author of Genesis knew nothing about Jesus, never did, and that was not his message. And in that way, the Bible is not actually a book as such, but it's rather much more as the word, I think it's the Latin word Bible. It means library. And in fact, that's exactly what we have here. We have a library of books. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to focus a little bit on how much the Bible is actually not a book. And the fact that a lot of the things we include in our dogmatic matrix is based on the idea that the Bible is, in fact, a book. And it has to be a book for us to take upon us some of the beliefs that we hold. So let me get into this article. I have it in front of me. I'm running it off Substack directly. So excuse me if I scroll here and there. And I'm just going to kind of freelance out of it and reference it here and there to make sure I stick to the kind of topic. A book is generally, when it's not referring to the way people bind these things, it's a work of a single author. That through fiction or nonfiction, it aims to convey a message through coherent thought. So a book is not supposed to contradict itself. It's supposed to give us one and the same message all the way through by using various ways in which literature can be used: poem, song, story, fiction, history, etc., etc. And from very small, this was the idea. Nobody ever really said, let's sit down and tell you how the Bible is a book, but subtly and quite substantially throughout my time in the Pentecostal charismatic church, this is something that lies as a substrate, as a foundation for belief. that it in fact is a book with one author and one message. This idea was so ingrained in me that I think I mentioned last time that when I did enter ministry in 2004, I decided not to read anything for the first 10 years, but the Bible. I was never a big reader anyway. I became a big reader about 5 years ago. I started reading for the real first time in my life. Before that, the Bible was the only thing I read because I really believe it's the only thing I needed. No other information is needed. The Bible supersedes all of its historical context. It has a coherent message, and that was absolute and was eternal. To my shock, when I did started reading outside of the Bible, I started realizing that this is actually a dogmatic belief, that the Bible is a coherent book. And it's a lens through which I've been reading the Bible all my life. And I realized that there was another lens through which I could actually read the Bible. And this was a lens that believes or understands that the Bible is in fact not a book, but a library written by many authors who each had a historical, cultural context. Many of these authors had different theological beliefs. Some of these books were written centuries apart. And so the Bible does not really qualify as a book. And if you want it to be a book, you almost have to dogmatically believe it's a book because the evidence shows otherwise. And I started realizing that the idea that the Bible is a book is a presupposition I had, and that I came to the Bible with this presupposition. In other words, I enforced it onto the Bible, when the Bible was actually clearly telling me that it wasn't a book. I forced it into the box of a book because of my culture, because of my religious denominational beliefs. Engaging the historical context of the scriptures through the rich history of biblical critical scholarship of the last 200 years, it slowly opened my eyes to the historical context, the various historical contexts, and the different types of authors by whom which the Bible was written. And once I was brave enough to put aside my presupposition, a whole new world of the scriptures opened for me. And it absolutely intrigued me, and that's why I haven't stopped searching and looking and studying the historical context of the scriptures for the last 4 or 5 years. I'm constantly reading, constantly studying. I think I said this in my previous video, but I want to say it again. It's absolutely true that I think I spent more time studying the Bible in these last 4 years, 4 or 5 years, or the historical context of the Bible, than what I spent studying for my engineering degree in 94, 95. I've really thrown myself into this process. And it seems to me that this world of historical context was not based on what my tradition taught me in church, but it was based now on trying to understand the scriptures from the perspective of those who wrote it, and not my 21st century perspective. And I think that was when the penny dropped for me. I realized that I was reading the Bible from my context. I was making Jesus believe and say the things I believed and said. I was cherry picking the messages of Jesus to fit my 21st century capitalist white culture. And the reality is that Jesus probably wouldn't fit very well into my life and the way that I construed him. I created a caricature basically of him that was based on my own culture. All right. So to aid in this endeavor of mine, I was learning about the cultures and the literature, the types of literature, that these historic cultures were engaging in, the literature of the surrounding peoples around Israel and the writers of, for instance, the Old Testament. And I was trying to strip myself to the best of my ability from my modern Pentecostal or charismatic lenses that I felt was forced onto my eyes since I was a young kid. And so often what I think happens is when we are taught certain things before we have the ability to critically think about them, it becomes so ingrained that later on in life, although we might be amazing critical thinkers in other disciplines, in the discipline of religion, we lose the ability to critically think about anything because we were, I don't want to use the word indoctrinated because it's a neutral word and can be misconstrued, but because of what we were taught, we lose the ability to critically think about the things that were ingrained in us before we got critical thinking, if you see what I'm saying there. So after about the last 5 years of this journey, I wanted to pin down some of the reasons for coming to the conclusion that I hold today, that in fact the Bible is not a book. And today I want to walk through, I've got about 3 or 4 main reasons. Let me see how many I got here. I've got 3 reasons why I believe that the Bible can't be seen as a book, and it has to be understood as a library, and it has to be studied as a library. We cannot just assume that what someone wrote in the 6th century BCE in Jerusalem is exactly the same context and holds the same meaning as what a New Testament writer 600 years later or 500 years later pens down. It just doesn't work like that. It's not how the Bible works. You have to force it for it to say those type of things. All right. So the first thing that I realized, and I'll try and explain to what degree I realized this, but it's quite an obvious one, but I don't think we really think about this enough, is that the Bible is written by various authors. These are people that are writing down things. Now, if you spent time in the Old Testament, for instance, and you've taken off your dogmatic lenses and you are just reading it for what it tells you, you realize that really these are people. A lot of the ideas about God are the ideas of people. They project things onto God, their God in that sense. In Yahweh, of course, is the Israel God. It seems just way too human, too selfish, too petty, and too vindictive to really portray anything close to at least the idea that many of us hold to what a loving God should be like. And the point here is just simply to realize that we have many authors, and each one of these authors has a cultural filter through which they put things down. And the further you go back, the more primitive that filter becomes. The more removed it is from a modern day type of filter that, for instance, we would have on. So, okay, we've always understood the Bible to have multiple authors, right? That's no news for anyone. And some of the most important ones we believed were, for instance, Moses, David, Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Peter, Paul, Matthew, John, and we can list. And often many of these authors or the writings get the authority in some way from us knowing who wrote these books, right? So when you refer to Genesis 1 or 2 or 3 or 12 or Exodus 17 or whatever it might be, we take it on authority because we believe Moses wrote this. And Moses was an incredible, godly man who got the tablets. And so if he wrote it down, he saw God face to face. If he wrote this stuff down, we better accept it. And so a lot of our authors are people that had a close relationship with God according to the writings, and therefore we attribute authority to those writings. But I've realized that the picture is rather much bleaker than just the Bible having many authors. because in many of these cases, we actually don't know who the authors of the books are. And that presents a problem because if we realize, for instance, hypothetically, that the Genesis 1 account was in fact just written by a priest of the 6th century post-exilic period in Jerusalem, that the Genesis 1 account, in the beginning, God, this, day 1, 2, 7, etc., Adam, Eve, was not written by an authoritative figure like Moses, but possibly by an elite scribe of the post-exilic Israel. You know, that does something to the weight with which we view some of these writings. And diligent scholarship has brought us to realize, for instance, that Moses did not in fact write the Pentateuch. In other words, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So it's bleaker than just thinking, oh, it was written by many holy men. It's bleaker than that because it wasn't, we don't even know who wrote these books, right? And I don't want to go into evidence for that, but this is scholarly consensus amongst most scholars who look at the Bible from a neutral perspective, not trying to prove their religion or their dogma, come to the conclusion that Moses could not have written these books, right? And this is the most sacred part of the Old Testament. And from these books, people still today draw inspiration, direction. I'm not saying that is wrong. There's many stories in there that you can get great things from. There's also many stories in there that you don't want to live by because they are horrible. And it's just that we don't know who the authors of these first books were. Now, yes, it was traditionally accepted, possibly as the books of Moses. The New Testament portrays it as the books of Moses. I know that. But it seems like we know now that it just doesn't. It just wasn't written by Moses. It seems, as far as all the evidence shows, that the books were actually redacted. In other words, they were edited for a type of publication around the 6th century BCE. Now, this is if Moses lived around 1.4 or 1.3, 1400 or 1300 BCE. This is 700 to 800 years after Moses. That's when these books were actually redacted and put together. That's the first evidence we have of these books. We're not saying these books were made up of whole cloth, but I think most scholars realize there must be some historical kernel to them, but they were not written by first-hand witnesses. The books we have today in our Bible were not written by Moses or Joshua or the people that were in the wilderness, for instance. They were written hundreds of years later. Right. The books show evidence of anachronisms, right? Doublets, and they often are in tension with one another. They have different writing styles. They have different Hebrew than what Moses might have encountered at that time, or this we can see that they're written in different styles and in the different versions of the language. And they come from very different eras. So the question everybody asks us, who wrote these books then? And the reality is we actually don't know. Nobody knows who wrote Genesis. Nobody knows. All we might infer is that it was written by Israelite, scribe, elite from the 6th century, possibly. And that's all we really know about them. And we cannot produce, even those that believe that these books were written by Moses because the Bible says so, cannot produce any real evidence in that direction, besides pointing back into the Bible, which is a problem. It's a circular argument, and it doesn't hold outside of dogmatic circles. This is why scholars reject it. But this is not this only. Many of the Psalms traditionally are attributed to David. They are thought to come from post-exilic period, much long after David, late 6th or the early 5th century BCE. We now know that much of the book of Proverbs, also traditionally attributed to Solomon, some of it actually comes from Egyptian wisdom literature. and was also compiled in the 5th and 6th century BCE. Right, so we're talking about 300 to 400 years after David and Solomon. Someone else is writing these things, and so it goes also for the book of Ecclesiastes. Although the first portion of Isaiah might possibly date to the 8th century, where a prophet named Isaiah would have written down some of it, the later chapters from chapter 40 onward comes from a period after the exile. And so it's pretty obvious that Isaiah, a man by the name of prophet Isaiah, the one we all have in our minds when we mention the name, did not write all of Isaiah. That pretty much the second half, and some think that there's 2 parts, some say there's 3 parts, but they were not written by Isaiah in the 8th century BC. These latter parts were written by later people, prophets, scribes, we don't know, in the same line of tradition, maybe, using Isaiah's name, possibly, and these were grouped together to form one book, Isaiah. And so the reality is that even something like the book of Isaiah is not really a book. It itself is a library. It itself is a compilation of prophetic texts that are put together at later periods. And this, unfortunately, seems to be the case for a lot of the writings in the Bible. Even it seems like within the New Testament, we have books. A good example is maybe John or Mark, where there are portions of these books that were added 100 to 200 years later to these Gospels. So we don't really have a book of Mark. We have a library of at least 2 parts, as far as I know. And the book of John, some scholars believe it's a multifaceted text that was put together. The reality is most of the books in the Bible, maybe with the exception of some of the epistles, are books that were written and rewritten and compiled and joined together, pieces, texts joined together to form one book. Not only is the Bible not a book, but many of the books in the Bible is a compilation of many stories. And in the Old Testament, it happens often that sometimes 2 traditions of one story gets brought together, either weaved together or put chronologically, and they preserve both traditions, but it's obvious does not have one author. So these are things I started encountering as I started really studying to the best of my ability, the Bible in its literary form, without coming to it and saying, no, this is one book written by God through every person, but it says the exact same thing all the way through, which is called univocality, and I'll do that in my next section. So when we get to the New Testament, I need to say something about Daniel as well. Daniel is one of my favorite books, and it was one of my dad's favorite books as well, the prophet Daniel. But here again, I just came up against an absolute wall of information that the book of Daniel was not written when it says it was written. It's set, of course, in the Babylonian exile, but it wasn't written during that time. It was most probably written in the 2nd century, and it's betrayed by its type and use of later Aramaic language, and also by a simple or actually a gross misrepresentation of who was the Babylonian emperor at that time, like getting the history all wrong and using language that wasn't there yet at that time. Scholars are pretty certain that Daniel was written in the 2nd century, but set in the 6th century. In other words, to my shock and horror, Daniel did not write the book of Daniel, but this is a story written, a very important story, but it's written more or less during the time of when the Israelites were under the rule of the Seleucid Greek Empire, and they were reflecting on their current context in a literary form by using a much older context. My shock and absolute horror, because I thought I had Daniel all figured out, and then I realized that I don't, because my assumptions were ungrounded. And I never thought to question any of my Christian assumptions, or my dogmatic assumptions, or my traditional assumptions. Now that I have investigated them, I just realized that the things I taught about Daniel, they do not stand. And I have to relook at them with a very critical eye again and rethink what I think about the visions of Daniel and who was it for and what was it actually talking about. All right, so I was very disappointed because it was one of my favorite books to teach and so on. Unfortunately, as we get to the New Testament, you would think that the picture would get brighter. Oh, well, in the New Testament, we know who wrote the books, and it just isn't true. It just isn't true. The picture doesn't get any brighter in the New Testament. We don't know who wrote the Gospels. They're anonymous books. We have traditions about who wrote the Gospels, and if you spend a bit of time in them, you'll quickly realize that we think Mark was written by Mark because someone said so. And the book of Mark doesn't tell us anything like that. We think Matthew was written by Matthew because someone said so at some point. But the book of Matthew itself does not tell us that Matthew was the author. It's an anonymous writing, a third-person anonymous writing. Same goes for Luke, and unfortunately the same seems to go for John, the book of John as well. They were written anonymously. Evidences for authorship, as contended by our Christian tradition, is so thin that critical scholars outright reject the tradition about who these authors are. And they do that in the light of what the books themselves actually say. And so I've started realizing that critical scholars actually take the Bible more seriously than people who approach the Bible dogmatically. Because the people who approach the Bible dogmatically, like me, I hold my idea about the Bible higher than what the Bible actually says. And I was defeating the purpose of honoring the Bible because my ideas and my tradition stood far above what was actually said in these books. And it was an absolute shock to me. I was horrified. It was a really dark place for me. And I had to be, if I can use the term, I had to be born again. I had to start as a baby again, re-looking at what these books actually say, now knowing what I have discovered that we don't really know, and we can't trust all of the Christian tradition about everything. As Protestants, we should know this. We reject Christian tradition that tells us that Mary was immaculately born or that we need to pray through her to Jesus. We reject many church traditions we reject, but there's some we hold on to because we like those. That's not intellectually honest. So, in the New Testament, we do have some books that we know who the author was, and here we are faced with what's called the undisputed letters of Paul. There's 7 of them, which most scholars agree when looking critically at them, that these were most probably written by the Apostle Paul early in the first half, in the second half of in the late first half of the first century. And that's kind of where it ends, the 7 letters of Paul, because the other letters that has Paul's name on it were most probably not written by Paul. They don't align theologically. They have a different writing style altogether. They use different Greek words. They don't. They just don't look like Paul wrote them. And so there are, I think there's 14 in total, or 15, 13, and 7 of them are considered undisputed. But the rest of them, like for instance, if I can say, one of the books that we hold to written by Paul, something like Ephesians, for instance. It's quite clearly a very, very different writing style, was not written by Paul. We don't know who wrote this book, but whoever wrote this book put Paul's name on it. Now, guys, today we'll call this forgery. You can't do that. You can't write a book in someone else's name so that it will be honored and listened to when that person is dead. And so, for many of the New Testament books written under the name of Paul, they fall under the disputed letters. Some are more disputed than others. I think Ephesians is one of the clearest examples. I'll just harbor on that for today. Was most probably not written by Paul, but yet we have it in our Bible as Paul writing it. So, you can try and get around this many ways you like, but someone writing a letter in someone else's name, pretending he's that person. We have a fancy name for that. I can never pronounce it properly, but let me see if I can find it here. It's pseudepigrapha, but it's pseudonymous, I think is how you say that, meaning it's under a pseudo name. I don't know if any of us will trust any pseudonymous letters today or books written falsely, not under an anonymous name like Pete Pompies, someone else's name, like Nelson Mandela. Imagine a book came out today written by Nelson Mandela, and it wasn't written by Nelson Mandela. And in there are things that contradict the things that Nelson Mandela actually wrote. This is what we have in the New Testament. In the undisputed letters of Paul, we have blatant contradictions of Paul's theology under pseudonames. This is not a book. This is a compilation of writings. Now, it doesn't mean that these pseudonymous books are completely useless and should be thrown out or whatever, but we can't include them when we are studying Paul's authentic letters or undisputed letters, or when we want to try and figure out what Paul actually was saying. They are useful to us to understand what the church at a later stage started believing. And they are very useful because one of the things you'll see very clearly from the difference between the authentic Pauline letters and the disputed letters is that the authentic Pauline letters, Paul's very clear that he is expecting Jesus to return in his own lifetime and that the resurrection is a future event. But if you get to the undisputed letters, there's now a delay that, it will take some time before Jesus comes back, and it's not imminent anymore, and we are already seated with Christ in heavenly places. This is not something that Paul teaches in his undisputed letter. So it's just really, really obvious. Once you've noticed it, it's almost impossible to forget about it and not see it when you're reading. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that even in our beloved New Testament, there are books whose authors we don't know. And unfortunately, some of them are pseudonymous as well, meaning that they were written under false names. I find that disturbing. Our position then is much more dubious than just having multiple authors in the Bible. In most cases, we don't actually know who the authors are. Now, I'm going to go off the top of my head here, because I never wrote it down, but I think out of the entire 66 books in the Protestant Bible, the undisputed letters of Paul, we know were written by Paul. And I think the book of Revelation, we believe, was written by John, a prophet, which is not necessarily John the disciple. And as far as I know, and I'm stand to be corrected, I don't think there's any other book in the entire Bible that we know who the authors were of these books. This is not a positive attribute. This does not lean itself towards authenticity, because as we know very much, like even in the New Testament era, people would actually add the name of Paul to a letter because it added credit. And we know our book of Hebrews, for instance, it doesn't claim an author, but people believe the early church believed that this was, or the church fathers believed that this was written by Paul. And it's one of the reasons why it's included in the New Testament. We now know it wasn't written by Paul. So who wrote it? We have absolutely no idea who wrote these books. We should be aware of these distinctions. All right. So different authors, different beliefs, different ideas, different context, and in many cases, unidentifiable authors. Right? By no means that I'm trying to diminish the value of the Bible. I'm just putting the facts on the table, because these are the facts that most Christians who live in the Christian bubble never, ever hear, because in their circles, these things are never questioned, these things are never talked about. For, in my experience, because if you did, you would be labeled a doubter, and doubt is for the damned. So that's the first point. Various and many unidentifiable authors. This is why the Bible is not a book. The second thing is that the Bible contains multiple edited and redacted sources. I've said a bit about this, but let me just work through this here. Many of the books in the Bible show evidence for editing and redacting. This is Old and New Testament. Books from the Pentateuch, like Genesis and Exodus, show signs that they've been compiled from competing earlier traditions. They've been repurposed, they've been edited for a 6th century post-exilic audience. The books of Chronicles, they are a later version of Samuel and Kings, for instance. I don't know if you ever realized, but you've got two versions of the history of David and Solomon in your Bible. Some of it is found in Samuel and Kings, and another version is found in Chronicles. In Chronicles, which is written, I think, about 200 years later, David's life is sanitized. Like a lot of the things that David does that is terrible, it's just it's whitewashed. It's just not there anymore in the book of Chronicles. And one of the most notable changes in the book of Chronicles is that when in the account I never wrote it down, but I think it's in Samuel, where it says that God made David count the people, and when he did, God punished him, and a lot of innocent people died, right? It seems like this was no longer something that could be believed by the time of Chronicles were written, because by the time we have Chronicles, we have the appearance of Satan as a more concrete, angelic being, as an enemy, more an enemy-like figure of God. And so in Chronicles, it explicitly says that Satan told David to count the people. And so this is a blatant contradiction, and it should be one of the simple ways to understand that the Bible is not a book, but we have competing sources, different traditions about the same thing. Because from the time of Samuel to the time of Chronicles, the actual belief system within Israel changed. Satan became more of a prominent figure, from possibly just being an adversary in some sense. He became an actual enemy of God and all that's good. But anyway, that's something for another day. So in the New Testament, we have the same type of repurposing constantly. The Bible is like when you make a croissant, you need, a short pastry. I think I said this last time, but anyway, short pastry, you need many layers of butter and dough, and you fold them together over and over and over and over again. And if you cut through them cross-section, you'll see all the layers. And that's kind of what I started seeing within the Bible, because this is how scholars view the Bible. And as a Christian, I never saw any of this. I thought the Bible was how can I put this, a sugar cookie, or like a muffin, who has a constant texture all the way through. But that's not what's going on. The Bible is constantly repurposed by the scriptures are constantly repurposed by the next generation, for their generation, for their new context, rewritten, refolded in, so that by the time you get a book like Genesis, you have in it multiple layers of many different times and many different stories, different views about God, all folded, different names for God, folded into the story. It's just way more nuanced than thinking this is just a book written by someone that tells you the same story all the time. It's just not what it is. And I've just become too old to not live in reality anymore. I want to know what's real. I don't want to know what people say about things. I go look and find for myself. I don't trust people who, when it comes to these type of things, who have a dogmatic approach, who believes something first and then tries to prove it. Can't do that anymore. I'm too old for that. I want the data, and I want to see how it falls together. Right. So within the Gospels, even our New Testament Gospels, this type of repurposing kind of happens. Matthew and Luke uses the Gospel of Mark. They repurpose the Gospel of Mark. Things are added to the Gospel of Mark, although they both use it. this is the reality of what's happened, is that Matthew and Luke adds a virgin birth, adds a genealogy. They add extras, they add embellishments of almost all the accounts. There's more angels in Matthew than in any other book. They add resurrection appearances. I'm not saying they didn't happen. I'm just saying the book they're using doesn't have resurrection appearances. And Matthew and Mark are repurposing Mark with possibly added information, maybe a Q saying source that they're putting into their work. Even within the New Testament Gospels, as a subsection of the New Testament, there's constant repurposing. And so when you're reading the New Testament, you're reading a very multi-layered account that's been reworked and reworked and reworked. It's just what you have. We don't have someone walking with Jesus that writes down every word he says. It's just not what we have. All right, I need to hurry a little bit. Even within the manuscript tradition of the book of Mark itself, we have later editors adding on resurrection appearances and a final commission as they see fit. And it's quite interesting to me that it's within the final commission of Mark that we have this idea that and they'll play with snakes and they won't die if snakes bite them. I'm sorry, I can't remember the verbatim. And we literally have churches that have taken pieces of Mark and they've built a whole Pentecostal, I want to use the word cult, around playing with snakes on Sundays and cobras and rattlesnakes. And it wasn't even part of the original Mark. What in the world are we doing? One of the most perplexing things about the New Testament as a pastor was to find out that the story about the adulterous woman, which I believe to be the best story in the New Testament, they catch this adulterous woman, they bring her to him, and he forgives her, and he writes on the ground, he says, those who have no sin, let them cast the first stone. And we now know that was added about 200 years later. Now, I mean, you can make the calcs yourself, but the odds of that actually being an actual story that happened, that only finds its way into the Bible 200 or 300 years after the writing of John, I mean, chances are really small. Chances are pretty good that this didn't happen, and this is a literary invention of later scribes. We have to be aware that this is what we're dealing with when we are dealing with the New Testament. This is not a book. All right. Often these layers, here we go. Even within the individual books of the Bible, there are often multiple layers of voices, editorial scribes at work to bring us the form we recognize today in our modern Bibles. These layered voices within the books, they don't always agree with each other. And we would expect from different sources, traditions, editors, scribes, that always apply themselves to the manuscripts. And it becomes obvious that the library we call the Bible consists of these layered, edited books and should not be considered a book itself. My final point for today is number 3, and this is the fact that in the New Testament, for instance, but I think this is something you see throughout the scriptures, people are constantly reading older scripture and then writing the new scripture retrospectively, interpreting that older scripture as if it is talking about them in the new day. In other words, let me just work through this with you. So it's the retrojective interpretations in the book itself that tells us this is not one book written by one person. One of the most enlightening discoveries I made is that scholars understand the Bible to be a library of books that are constantly being rewritten and repurposed for the new context in which the authors or the scribes operate. Older scriptures are being reinterpreted in light of later contexts, of later editors and redactors. And these reinterpretations are then themselves included in the scriptures, and that's what forms these multiple layers. A good example can be found, and this is just one of many, but a good example can be found in the New Testament writings, who took the Old Testament and reinterpreted the Old Testament in light of their new first century New Testament context. There are multiple examples of this as Jesus' followers repurposed the Hebrew scriptures. But maybe one of the most obvious examples of this phenomenon is the reinterpretation of the snake in Genesis as Satan. I'm going to just spend a moment on this because I think this will highlight this concept of retrojective interpretation the best. There's no angelic being called Satan in the early beliefs of the Israelites. The notion develops and it becomes prominent in the Second Temple period, in other words, after the exile. It becomes prevalent under this new time where there's apocalyptic visions and writings and new ideas about justice and monotheism. All these pressures together start forming this dualism between God is and his angels and Satan and his angels. It's not something we find in the early Jewish beliefs. It's something that develops post-exile. But by the time we come to the first century, this thing's developed so much that Satan is now the enemy and kind of like an arch enemy of God called the devil in our New Testament. And it's part and parcel, it is part and parcel then of the celestial hierarchy in the view of many apocalyptic Jews. And here we find our beloved apocalyptic Jews, the disciples, Paul, and Jesus himself. Christianity arises in the world and it starts to reinterpret the snake of Genesis as the Satan it now believes in. In reality, the ancient context for the snake is probably more analogous to a type of an ancient chaos creature or of the Levantine myth. And I've done a whole series on that, but it's not the devil, not according to the early writers. And so this reinterpretation of the older scriptures now finds itself in the new scriptures. And therefore, it seems like it's coherent. Oh, yes, Genesis does speak about the devil because the New Testament says it does. But the New Testament is a reinterpretation of the Old Testament. The original writers of Genesis did not have Satan, the arch enemy of God, in mind when they wrote the Adam and Eve account with the talking snake. It's a reinterpretation. And now because we find it in the same book, we say, well, they must have because the book says so. But really what we're dealing with is a later period, reinterpreting an earlier period. And the examples of this is really numerous. And this, in fact, how the New Testament works. So thus, this reinterpretation presents a superficial coherence between early and later authors, while it is actually a rejective interpretation from an earlier time. So this happens often throughout the Bible as it presents the illusion of a coherent book with one consistent message. But in reality, the later authors are interpreting earlier ideas or earlier authors to make sense of them. So those are my three reasons why I believe that the Bible is in fact not a book, and we shouldn't be reading it like a book. We should read it like a library. Number one, we have various authors, and many of them we don't actually know who they are. Secondly, we are dealing with multiple sources, multiple edited sources, and much of this is redacted by elites in polemic form, really, if you think about some of the writings of the Old Testament. And lastly, a lot of what is found in, for instance, the New Testament, but this is not just the New Testament. The example of Chronicles I mentioned earlier is another example of that, is a ad hoc kind of like a retrojective interpretation of earlier scriptures, now mixed with a later context. And both of these are found in this one library or book. And now we believe that the writer of Genesis believed that the snake was Satan, but he did not. So I hope I've explained that properly, but this type of thing happens all the time. So where does it leave us as Christians? And this is really like I don't really want to answer this question, to be honest. I don't really have a full answer for the Christian at this moment. I think often what I've found in my journey is not so much what to believe, but what not to believe. Not so much what is, but what is definitely not. Maybe that's a good start, at least. Parting with the belief that the Bible is a book is really, really hard. It disturbs the very foundation of belief itself for many of us. But I do believe that we need to rather face these realities, than put our head in the sand about them. If the Bible is inspired by God, it has to be inspired in a way that is not so easy to understand. I don't have the answer for that. Feel free to let me know if you do. Rejecting these obvious indicators within the Bible will leave us with pie in our faces within the next generations, because the information is more and more readily available to our children. And we can indoctrinate our children, but there's going to come a time when they are going to have to face the reality of what's really going on in the Bible. And unless we have explained this to them, they are going to rebel. And so I think here it's been important for me, just on a personal level, to not instill some of these dogmatic ideas in my children, but to be open and honest with them, so that when these things do come up, they will say, yes, my dad understood this, but yet he chose to believe this, or that. I think that's incredibly important for me, and it's part of the reason why I'm making this public. So rejecting these obvious things, I think a lot of parents don't understand that kids today use a lot of AI, and AI can summarize reality very quickly, or information really quickly. And some of this information is who wrote the Bible, and the scholarly consensus will appear on the page. And if you're ignorant of this, it's going to cause some damage. Okay, so no longer do you need to go to university to engage these ideas. In my time, that was the case. And we used to laugh at pastors who went to university because we believed they were unspiritual. They need to go to a seminary where they can learn to read the Bible the way we read it. Now I realize I was an idiot. I didn't realize. Anyway, we don't need to go to university for this information anymore. It's on your kids' phones. And they can get it with one prompt from ChatGPT. It's undeniable. Information is becoming more readily available in the modern world, and especially to those who come after us. Our children will not honor our traditions above the things that can simply be shown to be true. If we don't adjust, we will most definitely die out. I'm over my time, so I'm going to stop now. Next week, I want to speak about univocality of the Bible and why the Bible is not univocal. Have a lovely Mother's Day for those of you listening today. Otherwise, see you next week.